Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a case study that, on the surface, it's pure, unadulterated horror. But when you start to peel back the layers, it offers some of the most profound and I think genuinely disturbing insights into how the human mind works, specifically how it attributes consciousness, or, and this is the crucial distinction for us today, how it selectively denies it.
Exactly. The subject is Dennis Nilsen, one of the UK's most infamous serial killers. His crimes spanned the late 70s and early 80s in London. But we aren't here to, dwell on the sensational or the tabloid angle of it all.
No, not at all.
Our mission today, and this is really driven by the incredibly sharp analysis and the sources you, the listener, sent us, is to move decisively past the simple psychological idea of just generalized mind denial.
Yeah, that material you sent was fascinating. It included this really insightful critique of how classic psychological texts, like the ones discussing the mind club attribution theory, they really struggle with Nilsen's specific paradox. It suggests that just saying Nilsen denied minds to his victims is a massive oversimplification.
It's too broad a brushstroke.
It completely fails to account for the glaring inconsistency in his behavior. I mean, the central question is why? Why did he deny minds to adult human beings, yet at the same time show deep, genuine affection, loyalty, and empathy toward his dog?
And that is the core intellectual problem we're tackling. The deeper cognitive challenge here is understanding what you call the structural distortion of relationship. We're basically asking a fundamental philosophical question, but through the lens of extreme criminology. Is mind attribution a cold, rational, objective judgment of sentience? Or is it fundamentally a function of emotional proximity, relational stability, and, critically, the maintenance of total psychological control?
And Nilsen's terrifying biography gives us a window into what happens when those emotional requirements, the need for safety, completely override objective reality.
They don't just override it, they rewrite it.
That structural override is the key. It forces us to look at his history, not just for pathology, but for the architecture of his psychological landscape. So let's begin at the start, to give some context to the man who ultimately committed these acts. Right. So Nilsen was born in 1945, Fraserburgh, Scotland. And the early biographic details are, I think, essential for understanding the vacuum he spent his entire life trying to fill. We're not talking about simple childhood woes here. This is profound foundational instability.
Yeah, the sources are very clear on this. They highlight early experiences of emotional detachment, really intense isolation, and a deep-seated identity confusion. And a lot of that stemmed from complex family dynamics, but particularly the sudden loss of his grandfather, who he completely idealized.
And that loss, it seems, was more than just grief for him. It was the removal of his only reliable anchor.
It was. The grandfather was this figure of warmth, of stability, and his death was experienced by the young Nilsen as the ultimate inescapable act of abandonment. And that really set the template for all his future relationships. If you love something, it will leave you.
Wow.
And you pair that with his relationship with his mother, which was, by all accounts, characterized by emotional coolness and distance. So this combination laid the groundwork for his adult life. It was a perfect storm of emotional craving paired with an absolute dread of the inevitable cost of that connection.
And what makes his case so academically compelling is what happened next. Most people, they assume serial killers operate entirely on the fringe of society.
Right.
But what's remarkable about Nilsen is the paradox of stability he constructed in his adult life. He actively sought out and, excelled in these highly ordered environments.
Precisely. He didn't live on the fringe at all.
Yeah.
He served in the military, a deeply structured environment that provides clear rules, hierarchy, and a form of imposed relational architecture. A place where emotional reciprocity is minimized in favor of duty.
Then he joined the police force.
Another system predicated on control and order. And finally, he worked for years as a civil servant in the Department of Employment.
It's the sheer normalcy of those roles that just screams of his internal need for control. On the outside, he was a functioning, contributing member of society. He held down stable, respectable jobs. He looked entirely normal.
Completely normal. But the source material clearly identifies this vast consuming gulf between his outward presentation and his internal reality. It's described as a sustained loneliness and emotional vacuum that no amount of bureaucratic order could ever truly fill.
Right. And this internal vacuum brings us to the central problem that drove his subsequent actions. His defining, crippling difficulty wasn't with his work performance or his finances or following laws, which he generally excelled at. It was with forming and maintaining genuine mutual relationships.
He craved connection desperately, But the very nature of human connection, the unpredictability, the necessary reciprocity, the risk of it all, it terrified him to the point of incapacitation. This structural inability to navigate stable human bonds, well, that became the core analytic factor of his crimes.
So he was seeking stability. He found it in the military and the civil service, but he still needed intimacy. And that was the one variable he could never control. Which leads us directly into the crime profile. Between 1978 and 1983, when that internal structure just completely failed.
The scale of the horror is, as you noted, it's difficult to process. He's estimated to have killed at least 15 young men in the London area, and he often targeted individuals who were already vulnerable, vagrants, youths, people who were marginalized by society.
And the method of approach wasn't a violent ambush. It was insidious because it hinged on offering the very thing he desired and feared: intimacy and shelter. He would lure victims back to his apartment under the guise of offering genuine human kindness, food, drink, a place to sleep, maybe some shared conversation or sex. He established this temporary fragile bond built on the need of the victim and his own fleeting satisfaction of having successfully initiated a connection.
Yeah, and we need to spend some time here, listener, focusing on the mechanics of this initial bond. Nilsen wasn't just looking for quick transactional sex, though that was sometimes involved. He was performing a complex social script. It was designed to secure proximity and temporary dependence.
He played the host, the provider, the
Yeah,
savior in a way.
he did, and this allowed him to feel connected, but always on his own terms and in his own controlled environment, his flat.
And this is where the unique and absolutely crucial pattern emerges. This is the core insight we really have to focus on for this deep dive. It wasn't the initial act of bringing them home that was the trigger. It was the moment the relationship grew closer, the moment the threat of real relational commitment or even just reciprocal interaction surfaced.
hmm
As that proximity developed, Nilsen felt this overwhelming, paralyzing fear that the person would inevitably assert their autonomy, that they'd judge him or simply leave him.
And the sources make this structural function of the murder crystal clear. He murdered the victim specifically to prevent them from leaving. This is the psychological pivot point. It wasn't about satisfying an urge in that moment. It was an act of preemptive psychological self-defense
Against what?
against the impending unbearable pain of abandonment and rejection. The murder was a twisted, tragic way to exert total, permanent control over the relationship's endpoint. He was terminating the relationship before it could terminate him.
And if we look at the immediate aftermath, the postmortem behavior, this thesis just gains immense traction. He would keep the bodies in his room, sometimes for extended periods, and treat them not as objects of disposal, but as temporary companions.
Yeah, think about the descriptions he later gave to investigators. He would describe bathing them, dressing them, talking to them, watching television with them. This was not a quick pathological disposal process. This was a sustained, formalized ritual of simulated intimacy and domesticity.
A bizarre, one-sided relationship.
A relationship that could only exist because they were silent, permanent, and motionless.
The handling of the bodies, the later dismemberment and hiding them under the floorboards, it's horrific, yes, but its purpose has to be seen through this same analytic lens. It was about managing the presence and then the eventual disappearance of this stabilized relationship he'd created.
And that's the key distinction, which academic researchers have really emphasized. Nilsen's motivation was fundamentally centered on the maintenance of a distorted relationship that transcended purely sexual or aggressive motives. He needed them to stay. And the only way he could ensure that was by destroying the very thing that posed the threat of leaving their capacity for choice and autonomy.
Their mind.
Their mind.
This brings us to that famous contradiction in his case, his selective empathy. When we talk about this overwhelming, distorted need for permanence, it links directly back to his self-perception, a concept you mentioned earlier. Nilsen viewed himself, at his core, as essentially a person who was alone. The murder, therefore, was not the termination of a bond.
No, it was the ultimate mechanism through which he could finally maintain the fantasy that the other person would stay with him until the very end. It became the perfect, albeit perverse, illusion of permanence.
And this need for permanence directly informs that striking psychological contradiction that has stumped criminologists for so long, his selective empathy failure. The contrast is just. It's so sharp, and it forces us to question the objective nature of mind attribution.
It really does.
Let's lay out that contrast again, and we have to do this in detail because it is the linchpin of the listener's critique. On one hand, he showed deep affection, genuine care, and this protective instinct toward his dog, a mongrel named Bleep. He often prioritized the dog's comfort and welfare, speaking of it with true emotion.
He absolutely did. He attributed to Bleep a full, rich internal life loyalty, dependence, a capacity for emotion, and non-judgmental companionship. In his diary and later interviews, the dog was seen as a reliable, constant, and loving presence. The dog's mind was safe and predictable.
Right. Safe and predictable.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he showed almost no emotional reaction to the suffering of his human victims. He could extinguish their life, often by strangulation or drowning, which are very intimate methods, and then handle their remains with a cold, almost clinical detachment, and then follow that with those strange, distorted rituals of simulated intimacy.
And for a long time, psychologists focused on this as the classic selective empathy failure. The question became, why is a complex human being capable of language, fear, and suffering stripped of personhood while a dog is granted it? This brings us directly to the standard psychological explanation, the one you'd find in, introductory cognitive science tech.
Mind Club thesis.
Exactly. The standard model, the one we're attempting to refine today, introduces the concept of mind denial or attribution failure as the key explanation for his actions toward his human victims.
Right. The textbook thesis is pretty straightforward. Nilsen's cognitive mechanism was a differential attribution of mind. He attributed a mind one based on loyalty, affection, and comforting dependence to the dog. That relationship structure was inherently safe.
Completely safe.
But he attributed almost no mind, no capacity for feeling, autonomy, or self-direction to the young male victims he brought home.
And the analytical link suggested by this standard model is that this cognitive denial allowed him to objectify the humans, stripping them of personhood and moral standing. Once they were merely objects, he could engage the subsequent lengthy and macabre retention and disposal of the bodies without suffering psychological or moral distress. If they don't have a mind, they don't suffer. If they don't suffer, there is no moral cost to their destruction or retention.
It's a useful explanation for illustrating the link between dehumanization and moral collapse. But as the listener's sources correctly and sharply point out, it fails to explain the mechanism of the denial. Why was the dog's mind safe to recognize, but the men's minds were dangerous?
Exactly. If mind denial is the explanation, what structural force is driving that selective denial? This is precisely where we pivot into the deep dive and the advanced analysis of the material you provided.
Okay, let's make that pivot now. This is where it gets really interesting.
What's fascinating here is the listener's insightful point that we have to shift to focus entirely. We cannot look at this as a simple, objective denial of mind based on, say, complexity. We have to recognize that the structure of the relationship determined if a mind could be granted in the first place.
So mind attribution in this context isn't an objective input assessing consciousness, it's a relational output assessing psychological safety.
Precisely. We're moving beyond just recognizing a failure. We're analyzing the relational architecture model that governed Nilsen's internal world. The sources break down Nilsen's division of relationships into two distinct axes, determined entirely by two psychological criteria: stability and control.
Okay, let's spend some time defining these axes clearly. Axis 1 is what the material calls the stable subservient relationship.
This is Bleep, the dog. What defined this relationship? The dog provided affection and loyalty, yes. But critically, the animal was inherently dependent on Nilsen. Nilsen controlled the food, the shelter, the environment. And crucially, the dog could be reliably predicted to never leave.
The stability was absolute. Nilsen had 100% control within this dynamic, providing him with a vital base of security, a non-judgmental presence that mirrored the idealized relationship he was seeking.
Exactly. And because that relationship was structurally safe, guaranteed permanence, and non-reciprocal control mind attribution was also safe, it was reinforced. Granting the dog a rich, emotional inner life didn't threaten him, it stabilized him. The dog's mind was, in effect, a mirror reflecting Nilsen's own idealized safe self.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. But then we have to look at axis 2, the unstable reciprocal relationship. These were the young men he lured back to his apartment. They possessed the one thing the dog lacked: existential autonomy.
Autonomy's the threat. That's the key word. These individuals could leave, they could resist his advances, they could talk about him, they could judge him, and they could reject him. The relationship, even a fleeting one based on shared alcohol or shelter, was by definition mutual and therefore entirely beyond his control. The moment he established that bond, he introduced maximum terrifying instability into his life.
So the relationship structure itself dictates the cognitive response. If he saw them as complex, autonomous beings with the ability to choose to walk out the door, That vulnerability would become instantly unbearable for him.
Exactly. The result is the complete opposite of Axis 1. Mind attribution here became a massive, immediate threat because granting a mind increased his fear of rejection and abandonment exponentially. The analysis articulates this terrifying psychological process. Mind attribution leads to threat increase. He couldn't afford the luxury of acknowledging their consciousness.
So the synthesis here is that the assignment or denial of mind isn't some kind of cognitive error. It's a necessary psychological defense mechanism against abandonment anxiety. If the structure guaranteed permanence and control, mind was granted. If the structure guaranteed reciprocal risk and potential abandonment, mind was immediately denied via lethal means. This structural framework is so compelling, but it immediately raises the listener's next incredibly powerful logical question. If he feared abandonment so much, if instability was so painful for him, why did he initiate contact at all? Why open the door to that agonizing, predictable process of terror?
It seems like a fundamental contradiction, doesn't it? He was the author of his own cyclical psychological torment. The explanation here relies on the criminology and psychology concept of a disorganized attachment pattern. We need to explain this concept clearly for the listener.
Okay, let's pause for a moment on that because the term itself is dense. What does disorganized attachment look like in the general psychological landscape?
Well, in simple terms, it's a profound internal conflict that stems from childhood. Imagine a child whose primary caregiver is both the source of comfort and the source of fear, the safe harbor and the danger. When that child is stressed, their brain sends two simultaneous conflicting messages. Run to caregiver for safety and flee caregiver because they are the threat.
So they get stuck.
They get stuck. They might freeze or exhibit contradictory behavior, approaching a parent but looking away or crawling toward them and then suddenly pulling back. It's an inability to form a coherent strategy for comfort.
And the application to Nilsen is just chillingly clear. He had these two simultaneous colliding needs.
Absolutely. Nilsen had a deep, desperate yearning for connection and relationship. That's the run-to-caregiver impulse. This is why he brought men back to his flat, offering warmth and conversation. It was a genuine attempt to fill that vacuum of loneliness.
But at the same time, he possessed the flee caregiver impulse, an inability to tolerate the vulnerability, unpredictability, and risk of loss inherent in a living mutual relationship. The moment the other person became a fully realized separate individual, the abandonment threat was triggered.
So he was trapped in this cycle. He needed the relationship to start to fill the emotional vacuum, but he couldn't handle the inherent reciprocal risks of letting that relationship continue. The tension between the desire for connection and the fear of abandonment created this pressure cooker of cognitive dissonance.
The killing, then, wasn't a failure of control, but the ultimate act of resolving that dissonance. It was the flee response overriding the approach response, but only after the approach has succeeded enough to create the threat.
That's it. The moment of murder happened precisely when the relationship had been established, satisfying the yearning, but immediately posed the risk of leaving. That was the moment the anxiety, the threat of impending loss became psychologically unbearable. The killing was an urgent, desperate, and ultimately permanent attempt to resolve the structural conflict created by his disorganized attachment. He was resolving the relationship by stopping its movement. Hashtag 3.3 murder as relationship preservation, not destruction.
This brings us to the final and I think most insightful question the listener posed, which completely reframes the nature of the crime itself and elevates our understanding past standard pathology. If the fear was physical departure, wouldn't physically restricting the victim, locking them up, or incapacitating them have solved the problem of abandonment? Why did it have to be death?
This is the crucial distinction, and it reveals that what Nilsen truly feared was not just the physical location of the person, but the burden of the live mind.
That concept, the burden of the live mind, we need to fully explain that. What made confinement so intolerable for Nilsen if his goal was just to keep them permanently present?
A confined living person still possesses a live mind. That live mind resists, pleads, fears, and demands interaction. It generates emotional input. If Nilsen had simply locked a man in a room, that person would have been constantly struggling, mourning their loss of freedom and demanding to be seen as a person with rights and feelings.
That constant active struggle, the resistance and the demand for empathy, that would be the very unpredictable reciprocity he couldn't handle.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that a confined living person is a source of constant, intense emotional pressure. They resist, they mourn their loss of freedom, they demand to be seen as a person. This constant emotional pressure from a living, struggling, autonomous mind would have been far too terrifying for Nilsen to manage. It reinforces the very risk and unpredictability he sought to eliminate. It reminds him that he hasn't achieved true control, only physical restraint.
So confinement wouldn't have given him the psychological control he craved. It would have given him a constant, vivid, screaming reminder of his own vulnerability and the subjecthood of the victim. Death, however, delivers psychological silence.
Precisely. Now look at the relief offered by the corpse. The deceased victim cannot leave. That's the physical reality. More importantly, the deceased victim does not resist or possess emotion. They are static. They are silent. They make no demands. They offer no judgment.
And the most important point, the relationship could then be perfectly reconstructed only within Nilsen's imagination, devoid of any external contradictory input. He could project the perfect, non-judgmental, permanently loyal partner onto the body.
The deceased becomes the ultimate controllable object of affection. They are permanently present, permanently silent, and permanently dependent. This leads to the profound conclusion here. Nilsen's murder was not an act intended to end the relationship, but an act to freeze the relationship in a controllable, static state. He lacked the psychological capacity to handle the autonomy of surviving human mind. He preferred the idealization afforded by death over the reality of reciprocal life.
It's a fundamental paradox. He kills them to keep them. He trades the terrifying reality of a brief mutual relationship for the comforting fantasy of an eternal, non-mutual one. That truly reframes the entire analysis of his motive from simple psychopathy to a desperate, structurally distorted attempt at attachment.
It allows us to move past the idea that he was a pure monster and see him as someone whose internal architecture was so fractured that murder became the only viable path to achieving relational stability. That clinical distance is essential for extracting these insights.
I agree. It is hard to remain purely academic when discussing this level of horror, but that clinical distance is exactly what allows us to see the structure underneath the pathology, and that structure has implications far beyond the walls of his London flat.
So we've established how Nilsen's case operates on this deep structural level. Now let's summarize how this structural distortion challenges several simplistic moral and cognitive theories, especially as it relates to your own academic pursuits, listener, which focus on mind attribution in general.
Okay, question 1, drawn directly from the source material and our previous discussion, is vital. The basis of mind attribution. We've established that Nilsen believed a dog had a richer, safer mind than an adult human being. Does this extreme case mean that the fundamental criterion for attributing a mind is based purely on affective intimacy and perceived control, on relational safety, rather than a rational judgment about objective complexity or consciousness?
It strongly suggests that rational judgment is secondary, perhaps even completely disabled when it conflicts with the psychological need for relational safety. If granting mind status causes unbearable emotional threat, the threat of abandonment and non-control, the brain seems to default to a system of denial, regardless of the objective evidence of sentience staring it in the face. Consciousness is recognized only where it is safe to be recognized.
Which flows right into the second question, morality and imagination. Since he successfully denied the victims the threat of having a live mind, he also successfully denied them the capacity for suffering, resistance, and autonomy. He essentially made them invisible to his own moral radar.
That links the complete collapse of moral responsibility directly to the failure to imagine another person's pain. A failure driven not by malice, but by the structural requirement for self-protection against anxiety. He couldn't grant them moral rights because he couldn't afford the psychological cost of recognizing them as autonomous beings. Morality demands risk, and he was unwilling to accept that risk.
This isn't just about Nilsen's pathology, then. It's about a failure mode of the human cognitive system itself. When vulnerability hits a certain threshold, the system prioritizes self-preservation via denial over objective truth.
Precisely. And that failure mode, which is so vividly illustrated in this extreme case, demands we apply it to new contexts.
Now let's tie this back to the future, which is what the material strongly encourages us to do, especially for you, listener, working in cognitive science. The third question, mind attribution in new contexts. If our decision to grant or deny a mind is driven by feelings of control and safety, as proven in this case of Nilsen, what mechanisms are at play when we are asked to attribute a mind to AI, advanced robots, or synthetic entities?
Well, when we evaluate advanced AI, we often focus on things like the Turing test or complexity or behavioral parity. But Nilsen's case warns us that the true metric for widespread social acceptance might not be computational power, but relational utility and controllability. If an AI becomes too autonomous, too unpredictable, or crucially, poses an existential or even professional threat to human control, Will the societal tendency be to deny its mind, regardless of its complexity, simply to maintain psychological comfort and our perceived control over the relational and professional landscape?
That's a profound thought. The existential threat posed by a victim who might leave Nilsen's flat is the microanalog of the existential threat posed by an intelligence that might render humanity obsolete or uncontrollable. The denial of personhood becomes the immediate psychological tool for retaining dominance.
The murder of the victim in Nilsen's flat becomes a chilling macro-level analogy for denying personhood to any entity that threatens our deeply embedded structural requirement for control over our relational and technological landscape. We deny mind where we perceive danger, not where we perceive objective complexity. Hashtag tag 4.2, the unified conclusion for the learner.
This brings us to the final consolidated academic conclusion based on this deep and complex source analysis. It's a way of refining the original simple thesis into a robust framework for understanding mind attribution failure.
First, the key distinction. Nilsen was not someone who generally failed to attribute a mind. That's the most critical takeaway. He was someone who selectively assigned or denied minds based on established relational patterns, and those patterns were defined entirely by psychological safety and control.
Second, the fundamental threat he acted against was the victor's existential autonomy. The live mind was the primary threat because of its inherent ability to choose, judge, and reject. That ability is what made the human relationship structurally intolerable.
And finally, based on this structural framework, murder was psychologically experienced not as a destructive act, but as the permanent stabilization of the relationship. It was reconstruction into a perfect, controllable form, a state of emotional certainty, albeit one paid for with human life.
The source material confirms that your analysis, listener, is far more accurate than the simple textbook definition. We have successfully moved the analysis from mind denial equals dehumanization to the far more sophisticated framework. Relational safety determines mind attribution, and murder is the necessary mechanism for structural stabilization. So what does this all mean for us? We started with the basic horror of Derris Nilsen, navigated through the standard psychological explanation of mind denial, and we ended up with this powerful, sophisticated model of structural distortion of relationship. The value of your critical thinking, listener, in refusing to accept the easy answer has allowed us to connect a horrific serial killer case directly to fundamental theories of human cognition and even depressing questions in the future of AI ethics.
We've seen that in this most extreme psychological case, the deeply human structural need for control overrides the objective assessment of consciousness. And this leaves us with a provocative final thought for you to mull over as you continue your work. If we accept that the psychological need for control dictates whether we grant mind status to others, whether they are humans, pets, or machines, how deeply embedded is the element of relational utility in our everyday judgment of whether something possesses a mind? If the ability to fully and freely reciprocate creates intolerable risk is true, uncontrolled reciprocity fundamentally threatening to the typical human psyche.
A heavy but essential question to end on. We appreciate you providing the complex material that made this deep dive possible. We'll talk to you next time.